We are here today with a very esteemed colleague of ours, Dr. Omar Ashur, and we are here to talk about his book. First of all, I would like to introduce a little bit Dr. Omar. He is an associate professor of security and military studies in the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He is the founding director of the Critical Security Studies Graduate Program and the director of the Strategic Studies Unit in the Arab Center for Research and Policy Security Studies. Ashur is specialized in asymmetric warfare, insurgency and counterinsurgency, small state defense, democratization with the focus on the security sector and the civil-military relations. And he also focuses on security, terrorism, and strategic military studies. Indeed, Omar is the author of very well-known books in the security studies, which are the De-Radicalization of Jihadists, Transforming Armed Islamist Movements, and How ISIS is Fighting, Military Tactics in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Egypt. So today we are here to discuss his latest book. It is an edited book, and its title is Bullets to Ballots, De-Radicalization of Armed Movement, which was published in August 2021. Indeed, the book is focused on a very important topic, and it talks about the collective transformation of the armed groups or organizations to unarmed activism. And it is a very important topic, especially for Turkey and the Middle East, when we take into consideration what has been going on in this region. The book seems very interesting in the aspects that it takes into consideration 20 specific cases, or 20 or more, I think, right? Specific cases of armed organizations that have turned into unarmed activism, both being this as a political party or even as a social movement. The book covers 15 states from 5 regions, I think, among them Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and Western and Southern Eastern Europe. I think it's just through such a wider perspective, it's possible to bring to the reader of the full picture of the de-radicalization process. So now I would like to start with a couple of questions about the book. Thank you for joining us here today, Omar. And can you give us a little bit of background for the book and for the research project of the book?
All right. Thank you so much, Gloria, and thanks for SETA for the kind invitation. Always a pleasure to be here. First time in SETA Istanbul. The book really has a personal story and an academic story. So the background, the personal story has to do with back in 2012, in middle of the Arab Spring going on, and the hopes were high back then, including mine. So it was a heart versus mind moment where you were seeing what's happening and hoping really for a fourth wave of democratization and the second wave of de-radicalization compared to what happened in the 90s. That was the heart side. The mind side was more in the things look a bit different. And what really convinced the mind side was what inspired the other book that you mentioned, How ISIS Fights, because I saw a tactic that was done in Aleppo by Jabhat al-Nusra back then, and it was cheap, it was effective, it was limited resources. And it took a position that other forces were trying to take for 3 weeks, and the Nusra Front took it in about 10 minutes using that tactic. So which inspired the other book. And I was thinking, if this is, well, if that particular violent tactic and a series of them, not just one or two, or a series of them, work that effectively, then people will start thinking, why would I transform and abandon weapons, when this is working well? So then we might not see a fourth wave of democratization, and we might not see a second wave of de-radicalization. So that's the personal story. The academic story had to do with, we've been looking at this for like over, if you count from 2001, 9/11, or if you count it from maybe late 2009 when things were, when we had like a significant amount of literature dealing with de-radicalization. So we're looking about 10 years almost. And there was a lot going on, and I wanted to basically revisit some of the theories, the terminologies, the conclusions that has to do with de-radicalization in general. But more importantly, I saw that the focus was on individuals, on individual de-radicalization, because state has them under control, usually in prisons, usually in sustained programs, and you see what happens there. And there's a lot of literature on that, but there's not much literature on the collective, on like large organizations or factions when they transform. So I wanted to revisit that. It was also to revisit the issue of initiation and then sustainability. So you can initiate a collective de-radicalization process, but then the challenge is to sustain it. So there is no, as we were talking earlier, there's no end of history. You know, you can start it, but it can collapse. You know, and you can start it really well. Some of the processes that started in the Arab world were really well done, but then a complete collapse afterwards. Not just the Arab world, also in Latin America and Europe, in Western Europe, we saw that as well. So, so overall, I wanted to revisit some of the former conclusions that in academia, also even my former conclusions in the first book, in the de-radicalization of jihadists, which was done in 2008, 2009. So some of that I need to revisit, and we can talk in details afterwards.
I wanted to ask you whether you can give a short summary of the book. What is its main argument, and what is its main hypothesis?
So basically, the idea there was how, first, and why, second, do armed movements transform from using violent tactics to reach political power to using non-violent tactics, strategies, ops to reach the same end. So why do they turn from a militia basically to a party or a non-state armed group to a sanctioned constitutional political party or a social movement? So, some of them abandon politics in the sense that they don't vie for power anymore, but they provide social services and get involved with their own societies as social movements. So why does that happen? And how does it happen? And so we framed it in collective de-radicalization, and by de-radicalization we meant really the relative change, both could happen on behavioral, ideological levels towards nonviolent activism, and acceptance of gradual change within an institutional, constitutional framework. When that happened, what are the major or dominant factors that lead it to happen, and when do they come together, and how do they interact with each other? So that was the frame. The hypothesis really where we were working at two levels. So the meso level, which is the organizational and the institutional level, and we were looking at more or less four dominant variables: leadership, both organizational and institutional. So organizational, non-state; institutional, state. We were looking at what we called combat pressure, so getting tired of beating each other and blooding each other. And we're looking at interactions with the non-like-minded. So when you interact with people who think in a different way, and also interactions within the institutions and the organization. And we were looking at inducements, how the costs, basically, how much are you willing to pay for the transformation to happen, whether it's the state or the non-state. So we're looking at these variables and seeing the interactions between them. So that's all at the meso. And then at the macro, at the state or the international level, we're looking at the regional support, state regional support, because that made a major difference, we believe. And also we were looking at the democratization on the state level and whether it matters or not. And by democratization, it was not really democratization that was, it was used as a proxy, but the other proxies were difficult to measure. So we were looking at democratization as a proxy of one, security sector reform. We can talk about that because that was crucial for sustainability. And then also related to that is how balanced is civil-military relations. And then also the issue of transitional justice and what happened during the combat period. Was there any transitional justice process to address? So we're looking at that. The democratization, more or less like puts this in framework. So these were the basically 6 variables that were pretty much interacting and determining how things will go, whether success or failure, initiation or sustenance.
We've touched a little bit upon what direct radicalization is. I was wondering, taking into consideration the 20 cases that you have talked about in the book, how does the process generally happen? How does it
Okay, so there's a pattern of interaction, if you wish. Usually what happens is the first 2 meso-level variables, which is the combat. I used to call that state repression, but what we discovered is that actually, regardless whether the state wins or loses, or it's a draw, everybody rethinks. Because the costs, even if you win, the costs are so high that you don't want to repeat that episode, so it forces you to rethink again. State or non-state, and we can talk about the examples. But also, so the combat pressure and the interaction with the non-like-minded, basically people who think differently, thinkers, opinion makers, even other organizations, other states, who were thinking in ways that are less combative and more cooperative. So these come to the leadership of the organization in question. So the pressure from one side, the interaction. Interaction is giving him or them a way out. So that happens, and then the leadership makes a decision. The leadership is probably, that's my argument. I don't say it in the book, but I can say it in it's probably the most important variable in the whole set. Why? Because it has so many roles. It has the role of initiation, taking the decision. It has the role of justification.
So we are talking about the leadership of the state or the leadership of the organization in here?
Excellent question. It's actually both. It's leadership period. So in earlier works, we were focusing on the organizational leadership because they have to justify to their followers, having said, for a very long time that you have to take up arms, you have to fight, whether the justification is left, right, or center, secular, religious, or otherwise, somewhere in between. The leadership has done that, and now it has to undo that. So it's a big challenge. It has also to deal with spoilers, whoever is trying to undermine the process from the mid-ranks or from rival leaderships and so on. It has also to provide a narrative, like a story, because they provided a combative story. Now they have to sell a peace story. So the leadership has like a very critical role. So the focus was on organizational leadership, non-state leadership. But now we looked at it, when we looked at it further, because we had testimonies. So we had, I can mention them, Frank Pearl, who was the Colombian minister who negotiated with the FARC and later on with the ELN, so 2 insurgent Colombian groups. And also we had a double hat. So Ronnie Castrell, who was one of the co-founders and the leaders of the MK, the armed wing of the ANC in South Africa. And he was, and then became the deputy defense minister of South Africa, and then afterwards the intelligence minister of South Africa. So he had like both non-state commander insurgent role and then state leader role. And then from the non-state side, we had Usama Rushdi, who was the spokesperson of the Islamic Group of Egypt at one point, so also a leader from the insurgent side. So the government side were basically saying, what happened on the non-state side was happening exactly to us. The leadership was under pressure needs to justify the costs of the violence, and also interacting with other states that found a way out, and other government officials and even think tanks and academics, specialists on the subject matter, and so on. So and they also take risks. So I think we say some stories about de Klerk in South Africa, how he was manipulated in many ways, even by his own intelligence, and some stories from Algeria, how the factionalism within the military establishment was raised between a faction that wants to compromise and put an end to the violence, and then a faction that was saying, no, this is not the best way to go. And there was like spoiling going on in many ways, and we go into the details a bit in the chapters.
In here, you mentioned a little bit about the testimonies. So when I read the book, the part of let's say, I saw that a couple of the chapters are focused especially on these testimonies. So I was wondering, is there any testimony that deserves kind of special attention and you would like to share with us in here?
Yeah, I'll leave that to read the book. I don't want to totally spoil it, but look for two things: the Wimpy operation in South Africa and how that unfolded. It had to do a lot with leadership basically stopping a terrorism act, and then after that, that was for the security and the political institution of the state. That was okay. Check. They did actually. These guys are serious. So it was like a critical juncture. And then look also at the interaction within the organization. I think that Dr. Rushdie was talking about between the factions of the same organization, and how there was a faction that was not very happy with the whole peace process, and another faction wanted to escalate, and how they interacted with each other. So that's an internal testimony from the organization that tells you, it's always gray. It's never black or white. And these internal interactions were critically decisive too, because it's like a counterinsurgency operation in a way. It's a contest for loyalty. Like you're trying to convince your grassroots and the mid ranks that this is the right path to go, and then you have others who are trying to influence them a different way. And these interactions, how they unfold, is quite critical. Look for that in the book, but also look for two stories as well. Chile's first suicide bomber, who became, Chile's foreign minister after that. Well, he wasn't first suicide bomber. He almost became the first suicide bomber. That's what he says in his testimony, in his memoirs as well. And also for Uruguay's former president, who was for a while used to rob banks, and then decided that not the best way to undermine capitalism. There's other ways to make sure that the rich repays the poor in different via different schemes. So these are some of the highlights within the book that you may find of interest.
I think they are very interesting because, like, how can I say it? Going from a bank robber to president or going from suicide bomber to a minister, it's a great change, and we need to look upon that. I will go a little back to the methodology of the book. So in the book you mentioned about 3 qualifiers. You make a distinction in there, and you bring something new with these three qualifiers, which are namely the behavior, ideological, and organizational. Why is it important to make such a distinction, and what is the impact of these 3 qualifiers on the process of de-radicalization itself?
I think it was probably, if I have to pick one of the most important contributions, not of this book, I will never claim it for only the book, but also for the literature on. So hats off for all the scholars who work on that subject matter. Was the distinction between behavior and ideology, because ideology influences behavior, but it does not always determine it, and the behavior in many ways can be independent of it. And the 2 examples I just gave, but are like those guys, bank robber turned president, or almost suicide bomber turned leader of diplomacy. is they still uphold, they're still proud of what they've done. They will frame it in a way that they are, we did not abandon the cause. We just, the cost of that way was partly unethical and partly so costly that it would not serve the cause, it will undermine it. So therefore, and then the other side as well. It's not a black or white. The other side as well may have some very good points that we can learn from. So this is how it's framed. So that's why I had to use qualifiers, and I was critical a bit of like the disengagement, de-radicalization, that is this dichotomy that one has to do with behavior, the other has to do with ideology. It's never like that. It's a spectrum. And if you decided to de-radicalize, you will have to change some of your behavior. And if you decided to abandon violence, you will also have to change. Even if you did not reach it, you will have to reach full abandonment. You'll have to change some of the behavior. And we see how this is so complicated. So I'll come back to the three qualifiers, but how it is so complicated in cases where you were in combat. So the Syrian cases with the three armed Islamist organizations in Syria, they were constantly changing, updating ideology, narrative, behavior, even organizational structure. And also there's a chapter on the Taliban. This is before the victory. We predicted the victory. We said Kabul is going to fall in days after the withdrawal, and this is what happened. So hats off to Tom Johnson there, 8th chapter, and also but you saw the ideology changing while in combat. They didn't leave the arms; they were still fighting, and they were still shooting, and there was still actually suicide bombing in this case. But you had the narrative is changing, behavior is changing, elements of the ideology is changing. The same group that was burning tapes and videos and televisions in Kabul streets in the 90s are very quick, very slick on Twitter, on social media, on Telegram, on other. So a complete change in terms of the behavior and the narrative, and also in many ways it's a testimony that actually you will see ideological and behavioral changing going hand in hand, and some of them they didn't reach de-radicalization because they never abandoned the arms, but it's heading in a certain direction. So I had to use three qualifiers: behavioral, ideological, and organizational de-radicalization. So behavioral, I meant the change in behavior in a sense that ceasing to use arms or to use violence in any way to reach social and political objectives. Ideological has to do with the de-legitimization of political violence in general, and via it usually comes with a whole narrative dissected into historical, political, instrumental, socio-psychological, so the glorification of violence, and whoever perpetrates it fights down. Instrumental in the sense that it's not that effective anymore, more ineffective than effective. And then other dimensions. So the ideology comes with an ideology. If you use religion, of course, there's a whole jurisprudential arguments in it. It's like more like theological, and it has to do with theology in many ways. And so then you come with this narrative, and you come with this package, and then you switch the ideology. And then organizational, which is some people conflate de-radicalization with DDR, with disarmament, demobilization, reintegration. It's not exactly DDR, but the organizational element of de-radicalization is probably the closest to DDR, in the sense that you dismantle the capacity to use violence among the organization. So your arms, your units, your command and control structures, basically you dismantle them. So even if things changed at a later stage, you don't have to use them. The FARC is in that situation now. They dismantled a lot of they kept some, but they dismantled a lot. And then now, because of the crisis in Colombia again, they're having troubles restarting, or the commanders who want to restart, to replace it, who are not the majority, they're having problems restarting.
Omar, from the cases in your book, I noticed that most of them, let's say, are in the Middle East. So this kind of brings to us that making Middle East one of the most important regions in terms of de-radicalization. And can you tell us shortly why it is so, and where does the region stand when we compare it to the other regions that you have mentioned in the book?
Yeah, we had about uh, 4 countries: Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, and Libya represented. We took cases from there, so it's not, the country is not a case study, right? The case study is the actual process. So not even the organization is a case study. Of the organization is the case. So we looked at those countries, and there was some comparisons with the others. So the reason this region is important simply because the Middle East has the highest number of victims of political violence of all sorts, from terrorism all the way to wars, in the world, and also the highest number of conflict per capita in the world. So it's a very violence-stricken region. Transformation from violence to non-violence, and it's mostly interstate. It's mostly intrastate. Intrastate. There is interstate, but mostly intrastate. So Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Libya, so on. Algeria previously, but also interstate: Algeria, Morocco, Israel, and all the regions around it, and so on. Um, uh, so that's one. The transition from violence to non-violence we argue, may solve some of the interstate ones. So that's why it's important. The other problem is that region is rich, a lot richer than other areas. Latin American example, but it was also, so it has the state capacity to fund the transformation from violence to non-violence. It was always a problem in the Latin American cases because they didn't have the money. So that's the third issue, is that it doesn't have a problem with initiating, but it has a problem with sustainability. Yeah. So it has a problem with sustainability because part because of the type of the regime type that exists. So some of the regimes in the regions, authoritarianism, repression, corruption, and so on. Latin America doesn't like that, but it has a different process in terms of sustainability. We looked at all of the Southern Corn. I think the Aldo Matisi's chapter was excellent on that dimension. So that also has to do with the macro variable, which is the democratization. So we linked it. But also the final part has to do with the cases where I call it outliers. So where you have things are set and they look on paper, they look quite good. PKK Turkey peace process 2013, 2015 is, well, 2004, 1999, but the 2013, 2015 specifically, because there you had the charismatic leadership on both sides, both willing to have a compromise in ending this. Potential to become a political party, and so there's opportunity structures, leaderships. So things are lined in a right way, and then a Syrian civil war in one way or another undermined the whole process. So you had the whole regional dynamics going on as well, even though the rest of the meso and the macro may be around there. So the challenge of sustainability in the region, and it has to do more with macro as opposed to meso level variables. So that overall, this is what makes it a bit
different from the other regions.
A bit different, yeah. There are lots of commonalities, but the differences are there.
Great. Indeed, you touched a little bit about Turkey, and we spoke about it earlier before coming in here. I was wondering, are there any lessons learned for Turkey that can come from the book, from the outcomes of your book?
That's a hard one. I tried to stay away from the policy implications, and I left it to be interpreted, But I assume basically, I think there's more to learn from the failures and from the successes of the others. So where did the other go wrong when in terms of, so Turkey has no problem with initiation because, as I said, it was initiated a few times. The problem is with sustainability. And I think what's happening in, or the crucial part in this one is the regional back for the insurgent side. So there's always an opportunity and an incentive to keep on fighting as opposed to compromising. And I think there was the idea of like, you need to believe on the insurgent side, on the commander side, you need to believe that there is no way forward by bullets, that you will not achieve your objectives. If you keep believing in that, then and that, or if you're going to lose at the ballot box, that's a crisis of, again, of the FARC. So there's some lessons there for PKK. It's just the FARC assume that they're more popular than they actually are, and when they went in the elections, 0 seats, 0. Only the seats that where they were appointed by the peace deal, so 5 in the Senate, 5 in the representatives, and that's it. So and that has to do also with being so violent that people just turned away. So the support for the peace agreement does not mean the support for the insurgent group that was fighting, and I think that's part of the problem there here. Like, part of the problem is, okay, we put down the arms and we run in elections, so what are we going to get? Now we have regional support. We have, a few mountains areas, a few, we can operate. But if we turn into a political party, so then you need to create that opportunity structure to enhance the incentives. Let's put it this way.
Just to not to summarize, but I was wondering why de-radicalization is an important process. What is it? What do the states reach after this de-radicalization process?
There's a lot at stake. So peace building, stability, democratization, ending political violence, all of that are human security, state security. All of that is at stake. If a collective de-radicalization occurred, you just need to look at Northern Ireland, the Troubles, and now, totally different dynamic. That's a process of successful de-rad that. But also, it's the thing is, it's part of that is like the ethical. It's the ethical thing to do to end violence. But in terms of the interest, the continuation of violence has obviously the human and the tragic tragedies unfolding out of it, but also at the same time you just block the advance or the development, the progress towards peace. You just block it. And I'm not saying collective de-radicalization will lead to all that, but it will really foster the correct environment to probably approach that and move ahead in terms of it.
And as a last question, I would like to go in the title of your book, Bullets to Ballots. According to you, which one of them wins? So when you compare like the armed organizations that prefer to go to the ballots against the armed organizations that prefer staying faithful, let's say, to the bullets, which one of them wins when you take into consideration the cases, or maybe the other ones that you have left outside?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. That's a heart versus mind question again. It's really difficult to say. It's you need to go case by case. But here's the thing, that we saw the trajectories, and the argument was, does it happen usually after a defeat, after a draw, or after a victory of the insurgent side? After we're talking about the insurgent side specifically. And the answer was, it happened after all three. Like it happened after defeats. We have the whole of South America, it's all defeats. Well, even the cases in Libya and in Egypt, it's defeats, but it happened after defeats. It happened after, we call it draws or constructed draws, because the UK government was winning the fight against the IRA, but it had to construct it as, so that they can also convince their followers and mid ranks. So it was a constructed draw, and that or a hurting stalemate, as our colleagues in conflict would frame it. Um, the IRA, Algeria, El Salvador, the FMLN, and elsewhere. But also, it can happen after victory. So the insurgent victory, we saw the case of the Sandinistas, where you win by arms and then you lose the elections. So what now? Well, you hand over. But you can obviously, it did not go like from 1990 till 2006. It was going that way. You won, and then you lose the elections. But then you want to get power in any way. So that's why I'm saying it's not the end of history, even if it can be replayed. But finally, if the violence keeps on, and I'm talking state and non-state now, if the violence keeps on being the most effective way to reach political power in a regional environment, then this is not going to work. Then the ballots will never work, because the other side is watching as well, like whether in state or non-state side, and seeing that the only effective way to reach power is by violence, and just legitimate it one way or another, hyper-nationalism, religion, whatever. Um, and if that keeps on going in this particular region, which is very high on the violence spectrum, um, then it won't work. And I don't want to end on a very pessimistic note, but we have some serious challenges, and I hope the contribution of the books addresses some and put them very bluntly and very clearly to whoever is interested. Yeah.
Thank you, Omar. Is there any last thing that you would like to add for the book before we finish the session?
No, just thank you very much. I thank Zeta for the talk, and thank also my colleagues in the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, because that book was based on their first conference for the Strategic Studies unit of the Arab Center, and it engendered that book, and it was also thanks to the publishers, Edinburgh University Press. And we will have an Arabic version of it published by the Arab Center. Hopefully, at some point, we'll have a Turkish version of it,
Why
but so
not?
far, it's the planning is just the Arabic version. And yeah, I hope it just becomes more of a contribution to the body of literature. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Omar, and thank you everybody for coming in here, and those who are watching us online. We hope to have other book talks as well, and hope to meet you soon in the next sessions. Thank you very much.